Hey everyone, welcome to the very first deep dive on this channel. Today I'll be covering Zeiss Meditec, a leader in ophthalmology and microsurgery. This company is listed on the German Stock Exchange, and it's a company I don't expect a lot of people to be very familiar with, but it's steeped in history, and I think it's important for us as we go into this deep dive to focus on the founding of the company because it has implications to the present day. So let's jump right into it. So Carl Zeiss founded the company in Jena, Germany in 1846, and he was working as an optician slash precision mechanic, and he was producing some simple microscopes and having a decent amount of success with that. And that was the case for the first decade or two, until he met this man, Ernst Abbe, who was a physicist at the university, who helped him refine these microscopes and produce much more precise images and with less distortion. And that improved the quality of the images they were producing. And as such, the name Carl Zeiss became renowned for the optical lenses. So we fast forward to 1888 when Carl Zeiss passes away, and Ernst Abbe becomes pivotal to shaping the company as we know it today. He was a socialist reformer, a sort of visionary, and he reminds me of a Steve Jobs type. He just has that look about him, and eventually what he introduces was 8-hour work days as well as paid leave, which was unheard of at the time. He also believed that the purpose of the company should be to fund science and technology and improve human lives. And as such, he wanted to set up a structure to ensure the long-term sustainability of the company. So in 1891, he forms the Carl Zeiss Foundation, which is still present to this day. And the purpose of this foundation was to ensure the longevity and sustainability of their science and research, especially in the fields of optics and physics, as well as making sure that employees were taken care of. And I guess at that time, initially, it was also working with profit sharing as well between the employees to make sure that they're very well paid as well. So it's important for us not to underappreciate the importance of the Carl Zeiss Foundation, because I think without this foundation, we wouldn't have had the same company and the same corporate governance that ensured the long-term sustainability of this company. It reminds me of another company, which actually was a later foundation, the Novo Nordisk company, and they are based around the same kind of structure whereby they are having this level of corporate governance that ensures the long-term success of the company and funding research into diabetes. And you can see where that's taken them into funding for things like GLP-1. So I feel like it is really possible that this company continues to innovate and continues to exist by mandate of the foundation and what they uphold, as opposed to seeing some CEO taking some short-term gains or, potentially coming in and having some adjustments of, let's say, EPS growth and earnings per share. And that's what we care about in the short term, whereas they're really focused on the long term. And you'll see that in their research and development as we discuss. So between 1920 and 1950, they were working with microscopes and telescopes, periscopes and binoculars, even planetariums, but the majority of their revenue was coming from the military side of things, 80% of their revenue, in fact. And that was all paradoxical compared to what you'd expect the mandate of the foundation to be, but I don't think they had much say in what they were producing at the time. And ultimately, it ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1946, and that had a very detrimental effect on the Carl Zeiss company. So post-World War II, Carl Zeiss, the company in Jena, was subdivided and relocated to 2 different locations. The Soviets raided them for actual personnel, and they would call them almost prisoners, as they were relocated to East Germany. And then you had a group in West Germany as well, and patents were confiscated, equipment was confiscated, so it really, really hampered their success. And in fact, at some point, the 2 companies, East Germany and West Germany, were competing, in the same area as competitors, which didn't make any sense. And it wasn't until the reunification of Germany in 1990, that things began to turn around for the Carl Zeiss company. So some of you might be looking at this name ASML and thinking, I know that name, and I think a lot of listeners may be familiar with that name. But just to highlight how they got to this stage and how they're working with this company that is in the semiconductor industry. Well, at the end of World War II, they were not allowed to go back to working in the same fields of arming the military, as you may understand. And they deviated and started working in the field of metrology, which is the science of measuring things. And they became very, very good at measuring things. And ultimately, they ended up working with ASML, who is a leader in the semiconductor industry, as some of you may be aware, but I'm not going to be going deeper into that, what they do, which is the EUV lithography, but I just need to highlight a few key things for our listeners. So ASML has 100% monopoly over the EUV lithography, and everyone today, as of today, knows that. And it's basically the only monopoly I'm aware of that can't be disrupted within the next 10 years possibly, or 20 years, you could argue, because of the amount of investment that's gone into it. But Carl Zeiss was working with ASML in the 1990s and DUV lithography, which is deep ultraviolet, and then the EUV technology came along. And you could argue I'm trying to give Carl Zeiss a little bit too much credit and that it's actually mostly ASML. But in fact, ASML themselves value Carl Zeiss so much that they've gone in and bought a 25% stake in the semiconductor subsidiary of Carl Zeiss. And that's in order to produce these machines you're seeing on this picture and the slide. These machines are what they use to cut silicon wafers and produce the most advanced chips possible. And without these mirrors that are produced by Carl Zeiss, they probably wouldn't be able to do this. And that's why they've partnered with them so heavily. And I think that, again, speaks to the foundation and how important it was into ensuring that they constantly innovate and constantly reinvest as opposed to selling the company for parts. They had so many bumps along the road with the invasion and the World War II. The company was split up and eventually reunited. It could have ended at some point, but the foundation has ensured the long-term success and innovation into these fields. So I think it's important to say that if we see this sort of innovation in the Carl Zeiss company, maybe we can expect something similar in Carl Zeiss Meditec. So we fast forward now, finally, to the founding of the company, or at least when it was spun off from the Carl Zeiss company. It was spun off and actually merged with another company. I think it was called something along the lines of Aspelon Meditec. And the Aspelon Meditec brought lasers, Carl Zeiss brought the optics, and they combined that into one company. And later they brought in microsurgery under that Carl Zeiss Meditec company name. And now the company was focused on ophthalmology and microsurgery as their main two revenue drivers. So what has been the company's strategy since 2002 to today? Well, they focused on a few tuck-in acquisitions here and there to bolster their, ophthalmology area, as well as potentially also the microsurgery area. But they are leaders in the microsurgery areas, as they state in their slides. They're a #1 player in that area. They have a huge market share. However, the ophthalmology market is much, much bigger, and they are currently sitting at #2. And they're trying to expand, I feel, in terms of their acquisitions to ensure they have a plethora of options available, as well as expanding into new markets. And they are trying to expand into the US, especially, and China, as their main two growth drivers for the foreseeable future. So as far as innovations internally, they've introduced the SMILE procedure, which is their answer to LASIK surgery. As some of you may be aware, when your friends had glasses, they go in, get LASIK, take off glasses, and I can see. So that is their introduction, and they had FDA approval for that procedure in 2016, and it's been growing rapidly ever since. And we'll cover a little bit more about that shortly. So just diving deeper into their ophthalmology product mix, they have their diagnostic devices, their software solutions, and surgical devices. And they offer a whole suite of tools, and I think they make sure that they're partnering with hospitals, especially to offer the whole suite of options available. They can also get in touch with eye clinics and ambulatory services where small surgeries can be carried out. And those are their key customer segments. You're going to be dealing with businesses mostly, as opposed to directly with patients who are needing these procedures. Who is Zeiss competing with in the ophthalmology space? Well, Alcon is probably their biggest competitor, and they're competing on the surgery side of the business. But 50% of the revenue for Alcon comes from contact lenses, and I don't think they compete on that side as well. So they're not competitors in every aspect. And Zeiss, as you can tell, has their hands in every pot and jar, and they're trying to take market share in every aspect. So I think one of their competitive advantages is they can go ahead to hospitals and say, well, we can offer you the full suite of tools, as opposed to you having to go to multiple people, and that's a pain. And then, they're well integrated into the company or the hospital, and that's one of their competitive advantages. Their revenue growth for the last 4 or 5 years was actually really, really impressive. However, recently it's stopped growing, and it's actually decreased ever so slightly. And they cite the fact that a lot of this demand was pulled forward during COVID as well. And I could agree with that to a certain degree. It could be that we just see normalization of what the normalized revenue growth rate is, as opposed to this big, spike, and assume that that is the growth forever. I think that's more realistic. We can't assume that the growth is going to be in the region of, let's say, 1,300 to 1,600. That's about maybe 20% revenue growth each year. That's a lot. So I think we need to be much more conservative in our estimates of what we expect normalization to be in the range of. As for their EBIT margins, they've been decreasing actually at a very scary rate from the height of it of 22% down to 12%. And that is actually really, really, worrying, the price does reflect that. The stock is down 75% from its peak, and it's down mainly due to the EBIT margins, I think, which is one of the biggest drivers. So why is that happening? Well, the company cites potentially some challenges in China, which is introducing some national volume-based procurement, which means basically they're putting it up to the lowest bidder, and whichever company can offer their hospitals on a national volume-wide scale the cheapest products, then they're going with them. Now, of course, they might have some pricing pressure there that they have, or some pricing power, whereby, listen, I'm offering you the whole suite of tools. So they might be able to raise their prices ever so slightly. But again, it is challenging. But if they can get their foot in the door, maybe that revenue stays locked in for the next 5 or 10 years because nobody wants to change. And of course, China has a challenging macroeconomic, environment right now, and that's been playing a factor. Another thing they cite is the product mix, whereby their consumables, I believe, are the high margin products. And because of the demand being pulled forward during COVID, their consumable sales are being pressured. But they are working towards improving their mix of recurring revenue versus, one-time sales of these medical devices, which are quite expensive. Some of them are in the 500 to 600,000 range. But of course, those are not happening every day, and they're trying to work through this. The other thing is their R&D budgets are actually staying flat. If anything, they're increasing ever so slightly, and they have one of the highest R&D budgets in the ophthalmology space at 16% of revenue, compared to their nearest competitor, or their biggest competitor, who has a market cap of about 40 billion. They're only, spending 8% of the revenue. So you can see that I'm actually quite happy to see this, that the company does not, deviate from their mandate and continuously reinvest to improve the future growth of the business. I would be much more worried if the company is going on a downturn and you're reinvesting less into your future pipeline. So let's dive into refractive surgery and explain what has been going on and what the innovations are with their SMILE procedure. So initially you had the first generation of surgery, which was called PRK surgery, which required the removal of this epithelial or surface layer of the cornea. And the epithelial layer is removed by chemicals and through some ablation process, and eventually they get to laser the actual cornea underneath it. Now, unfortunately, when you remove something completely, you can't replace it, so you have to put a protective cover over the eye, and you have to wait for a while for that to heal. And then you have the second procedure, which is the second generation, and that's the LASIK surgery. The LASIK surgery was an advancement on the PRK, and that's the second generation. So basically, the difference between the LASIK compared to the PRK is you don't have this chemical removal of the epithelial layer. Instead, you have a hinge which is lifted up in order for them to laser the cornea. And then when they've reshaped the cornea, then they can close back that epithelial layer, and that reduces recovery time, and it has improved, the outcomes for the patients afterwards. You do still suffer from a bit of dry eyes from this procedure, and it is that a dominant procedure still to this day, but SMILE as the third generation. Now, the best way I can describe this is, I've seen someone mention this, is that you don't actually cut away anything from the top. What you're doing is you're cutting or removing from a sourdough the underlying layer of the cornea. And all you have to do once you've done that is just take it and peel it away with a 4mm incision. A 4mm is tiny. And then the healing and recovery time from this procedure is much, much better. So I'm actually quite excited about this procedure in terms of what it could do in terms of taking market share away from LASIK, which is the dominant player in this space. And it's not to say that even if, the only downside really of the SMILE procedure is that not a lot of people can, or there are some cases where it's contraindicated, which means that they're disqualified. 20% of cases cannot undergo the SMILE procedure because of how thin the corneas are, and then they have to go to the LASIK. But the good news is, with the lasers provided by Carl Zeiss, they can actually carry out the SMILE procedure and LASIK, as LASIK is carried out by many different companies. It's not one specific company. The SMILE procedure, however, is patented to Carl Zeiss themselves, so they can only be the ones to provide that. And I'm really excited about this because I think they can keep taking market share in this space. And this slide highlights really what the market share is in each area of the eye. Now, refractive surgery, which we've discussed, they have had a 35% market share in their previous annual report. And you can see that that market share is already growing to 40%. So that really highlights, again, the success they're having with the SMILE procedure and the SMILE device lasers for the SMILE procedures they have. Their microsurgery is 60% market share, which is amazing, and hopefully that can grow in time. But the areas they have some of the biggest weakness is the anterior segment of the eye, which is dealing with the lenses, because I guess there's less differentiation in the products they can offer in that space, as opposed to with the refractive surgery. But with enough innovation, hopefully in time, they can find something that is quite niche. There are other competitors that they have to worry about. But generally speaking, I think they might be growing through acquisitions or internal pipeline of R&D in that space. They have had a recent acquisition of the DORC acquisition, which we discussed in 2024, and that was for the posterior segment of the eye to help with retinal surgery, and as well they're dealing with chronic management of diseases such as potentially macular degeneration as well. So this is the growth of SMILE, and you can see that from the introduction and the FDA approval, they had 1 million to 2 million in sales. It took them 2 years. Then they were actually achieving 1 million, in sales of procedures every year, or eyes treated every year. And then eventually in 2023 to 2024, they managed to have 2 million eye surgery procedures carried out. So I think this is potentially going to be exponential with displacement of the LASIK, and they could potentially take up to 80% market share, and then 20% is left for LASIK. So let's dive into the recent acquisition of DORC, which is the Dutch Ophthalmic Research Center. And this was a sizable amount of money for 1 billion market cap. I am generally not a fan of big acquisitions. Small tuck-in acquisitions, sure, can possibly work, but generally, if you look at the research, acquisitions by and large are actually, they're not leading to creation of value, but they're destruction of value. And it's really hard to make them work. However, with that said, they have had a number of acquisitions in the past and they have made that work. And it really is important to understand how they're financing these acquisitions. So we'll go into that in a little bit, but just to highlight what this company brings. And it's also important to understand, I think, the main two things, which is, are there synergies? Is this the right company? And I think if you look into what the synergies are, then you can understand whether or not this makes sense. And one of the area of weaknesses they had in their business was the posterior segment of the eye, and they wanted to shore that up. Now, you could argue they could have invested in the research to come up with this on their own, but I think they saw that the presence of DORC globally would have allowed for more market penetration. In addition, they offer these surgical packs, which allows them to increase their recurring revenue. So they have this vitrectomy machine, which allows them to carry out surgeries in the back of the eye. On top of that, there is a lot of these vitrectomy packs, which increases their consumable and the usage of these materials. And that has led actually to an increase in their recurring revenue. And that is one thing I think that is a huge favorable tailwind for this company if they can continue to do this. Now, from their time of inception in 2022, they've managed to grow their recurring revenue up to 47%. And that is a sizable amount, a shift in business strategy, you could say, and that they're not reliant on these one-time sales. They're getting this revenue. Their revenue is more stable and less volatile and less cyclical in nature because they're not relying on these sales of machines, which might be only sold once every 5 years or every 10 years. So I am actually quite excited by, or actually quite, approving of what they're going for here. And that is a strategy of expansion, market penetration, and increasing the recurring revenue. Of course, that will cap out at some point, but at the same time, if they can't develop it themselves, hopefully there are enough synergies in there and that the market cap, or at least the size of the acquisition, isn't too large for them to make sure it works. One more thing we can look at is, how are they funding this acquisition? And I think this is very, very important, and it comes back again to that Carl Zeiss Foundation and how they ensure the long-term sustainability of this company. Now, I'm going to get into a few things here. They are not raising equity. You have two sources of funding when you are trying to make an acquisition. That is to go to the equity markets and say, hey, investors, please help us fund this, and that causes shareholder dilution. Or you can go to the debt markets and raise some capital that way. Now, what they've done is, because of their, sort of subsidiary setup where Carl Zeiss controls the Carl Zeiss subsidiary, they've managed to actually go ahead and go to their parent company, Carl Zeiss, and ask for a shareholder loan. They've funded this in part by cash on hand that they had, as well as a 400 million euro loan that they've taken from the Carl Zeiss company at a rate of 3.66, which is actually really, really good. I wouldn't say it's, the ideal use of their capital, but at least in this way, they're getting the best rate they can, and at the same time, it's majority cash funded. They are not diluting shareholders, and as such, I think that bodes well in terms of how they're planning their acquisitions. And it's all debt financed. It cannot be equity financed almost ever, because this company cannot issue more shares. I think that is going to be clearer once we look at the financials again. So just to go over who the CEO of this company is, it is Marcus Weber, and he's been CEO since 2022, and he's held various positions within the company since 2002, and he was CEO of the microscopy solutions and CEO of the semiconductor manufacturing technology, which I think is actually in the right, you want that person at that cross section where AI meets, medical devices. He has that background. So I think, as far as somebody who's competent in this space, I think that bodes well for the medical technology department to say, hey, let's take the guy who's very good at semiconductors, put him in the medical space to help accelerate our medical technology department, I think that's a good play. And he has obviously worked within the whole infrastructure of Carl Zeiss, so I can see this person being very, very well-versed in the entire Carl Zeiss ecosystem. And what about his stock-based compensation or, incentive packages? Well, are they tied to EPS growth? Are they tied to some metrics that could be manipulated a little bit? Well, they go over what exactly they look forward to in terms of their potential short-term measures and their long-term measures. And free cash flow and economic value added are their two measures. Now, in short, free cash flow is a very, very clean thing to look at in terms of what you would measure the success of the company by, and economic value added, which is basically the return on invested capital minus their cost of capital multiplied by their invested capital. And to be honest with you, those two things I'm very happy with as measures, as well as the revenue growth, to the key financial metrics that, if you were to compensate them through any bonuses they may get, I'm okay with, because they're not something that you can manipulate, or they're not very short-term minded. So some of the things that are worrying in an annual report, as I've read it, I would say is the reduction in the orders on hand, which is basically to say how many orders are we dealing with at the moment. And they have another measure which they use, which is book to bill, to say, are we having more orders to fulfill than orders we're currently undertaking? And they don't disclose this on a regular basis, but ideally that should be above 1. And I think that's going on in the opposite trend. It's below 1 at the moment, but they do cite that potentially is improving as of now. In terms of the expectations by the company and what their guidance is, they do say that they expect the margins to improve, and that this kind of economic and macro environment to continue to be quite difficult for the foreseeable future, at least for the first quarter of the year in 2024 or 25. But eventually they can expect, as this company says, we expect our margins to improve up to 16 to 20%. And that is a good sign. And to be honest with you, I would have expected something similar. So they're not setting their margins too high, but eventually they do say we can expect this to recover. And I'd rather be in a company invested, if I was, at this early stage. So let's take a closer look at the financials. Now, I generally try to adjust some of my numbers, such as the operating income, which is the EBIT adjusted number you see here. And in turn, the net income is also adjusted, because for certain companies, it's worthwhile capitalizing the R&D as basically an asset for the business. And if you don't know what I mean just yet, I'm surely going to explain it in a later video. But basically, in short, what it means is that you recognize more operating margin than actually is reported by the company. So let's say that the normal operating income is at 8% in this current year. but I would recognize it as 13% because I value the research and R&D that they're doing as an asset. So please just keep that in mind whenever you're taking a look at my numbers and if they don't match up to what you're seeing. But if we try to take a look and see what the gross profits are, you can see the trend over time that generally speaking, the margins were accelerating upwards up to 59% for the gross margin and then decelerating recently to 52 or decreasing to 52, I should say. And the same thing holds true for their operating margin, that this is a recent blip and it's gone down to 13% from a height of 26% here. So can we expect this to correct? Well, possibly. It might just be a recent blip and it's something that they can work through. And if we look at their free cash flow as well, we can see that their free cash flow adjusted for stock-based compensation, well, this is a sort of trick I'm using, but you can see that they are, at least free cash flow positive, even in their worst years. They've always been free cash flow positive. Now, if we take a look at the other version that I have here of free cash flow, which is one is without stock-based compensation and one with stock-based compensation, the trick is that they're both identical because this company issues no stock-based compensation, as we said, but it's nice to see that in the chart. So if we look at some of the elements of the balance sheet, the total assets are much larger than the total liabilities, which is great, and the invested capital has been growing as well. And that creates a barrier to entry and a barrier to success for anyone coming into the ophthalmology and microsurgery space. The shares outstanding have been historically flat and not increasing, which is fantastic. And as of late, as you can see here, the shares have reduced ever so slightly, and that's a 2% reduction as well. If we take a look at their adjusted ROIC numbers, however, we'll see that their return on invested capital has hovered at 15%, down to 11, 17, 14, and then it's now down to its lowest point at 8%, which is down to the fact that the operating income has reduced significantly. And they've also been increasing their invested capital base, so it's had a double whammy effect of changing the numerator and the denominator. And that's not a great sign because at this point, the return on invested capital is actually lower than the cost of capital. So hopefully that will change sooner rather than later. But if we wanted to double check a few things in terms of how they're financing their loans that they have, we're looking at the interest coverage ratio. We'll see that the ratio has been decreasing down to 10 at this point, which is at its lowest point. However, it is still within the healthy limit. I wouldn't be too worried about this. And this just measures how are they able to fund the interest expenses that they owe with their operating income that they're earning right now. So their operating income is 10 times the interest expense that they have. So that's not too bad. And as far as, well, if there is an economic downturn, are they able to withstand that? We can take a look at the operating leverage. Ideally, that's below 1, so that for a reduction of revenue, is that going to have a kind of like a leveraged effect, amplified effect on their net income? Well, no, we can't. That shouldn't happen with the ratio being less than 1. The other things that stand out for this company in terms of the green bars is that the interest coverage ratio is actually quite good. The net debt to free cash flow is quite good. The adjusted debt to equity is quite good. But because that might be just be due to the fact that the debt, because it's a shareholder loan, hasn't shown up on the debt to equity equation, as we discussed, when they took that loan for the DORC acquisition. The other thing is the invested capital growth rate is quite high. That's a good thing if you like companies to build moats around assets. And their dividend has been generally growing pretty well. However, there was a recent haircut to that dividend. And I have no problems with companies cutting dividends as opposed to always ensuring the dividend is maybe funded through debt and such. These companies are really giving out dividends when they can as opposed to because they have to. And the shares have been reducing ever so slightly. Here there's a production of share count 0.43, 0.72, and then minus 2% reduction in shares outstanding, which is great to see. And the free cash flow is some of the best in the business. The revenue growth rate is not so great. The EBIT margin is terrible. And those are the areas that we'd like to see some improvement in. And if we come to take a look at the projected numbers, what we see here is that the projected revenue growth rates are 7.63%,
9% for the operating margin, and then you have a growth rate for the free cash flow of 6.4 to 5%, and then the net income growth rate, or EPS growth rate, actually I should say, is 7.5 to 75%. So how do these stack up? It doesn't appear to be a very high growth rate, but what we need to try to paint this in a context of is relative to the company's size. And I would urge everyone to look at Michael Mobison's work about base rates. And what we can see here is that the base rate growth rate for a company of the same size as Carl Zeiss Meditec, well, if it was the average, it would be 1.76% growth rate for the next 5 years. Whereas they're growing closer to the 75th percentile, but they're not so out of reach in the 99th percentile that it's unlikely. But I would like my company to be in that 99th percentile, to be honest with you. But it just leaves a lot more room to grow in terms of what the expectations are, as opposed to downside. Because if you're growing in the 99th percentile, you can't really go much further up that curve. You need to be coming down towards let's say a mean reversion, so to speak. And the same goes for the net income growth rate. It's within the range of 7.75 to 8.43. I would say they're growing in the 75th percentile. They have 25 more percent to improve to become the best company of that size. So that's just how I like to paint the context of it. And these assumptions go into my DCF assumptions, and we'll discuss that shortly. So this is the DCF model that I try to use. It's nothing fancy. It's obviously has a lot more inputs, but I've gotten this from Professor Aswath Damodaran's NYU Stern page, and you can go by all means to his page and download this and play around with it. I've added some adjustments to it to make it work for me and what I need, but basically you put in the inputs, and these inputs are automated in my view just to help speed things up. But basically what we can see here without any adjustments of these numbers is that the current price of the stock is $61 and its implied value is 64. So there is a small margin of safety. Ideally that should be bigger. But let's assume you're a little bit more bullish about the stock. Let's say instead of 7% growth rate, titrating down to the terminal growth rate, which if you're not familiar with, don't worry, but these are just some fancy terms that they use in discussions for the discounted cash flow, and maybe at some point I can go over that if someone needs me to. But for now, we're just going to estimate that the growth rate is going to titrate downwards to something that is very long term and sustainable. So something at 4.4% puts it at close to the inflation rate. And so let's say we're going to adjust our growth rates up to 9%. What would happen if the operating margin increased from 20 to 21? Let's say we would just make that a flat 24. And let's say our sales to cap ratio, which measures how much reinvestment, every dollar of reinvestment is generating extra in revenue. You can say that set that to 1.1, which gives us a 10% free cash flow yield. I think that's a bit realistic. So, and then the cost of capital goes down. So you could say if you're really bullish about this company, then you can say it's still got a, it's just readjusted after the last calculation. So you've still got like at least a 20% margin of safety there, if not more. And that's how you can play around with the numbers to make it say or do whatever you want it to. But for me, I just go with the conservative approach and try to see if I can buy companies at fair value as opposed to really undervalued. And then you'll see that if you try to buy great companies at fair value, you might do better. Just according to the late Charlie Munger, that's a good way to look at things. And that if we just make those assumptions that we're buying this company with these conservative estimates, then you're getting a rate of return at 6.42% with a price in year 10 of $121. And for me, those are acceptable assumptions. I'm not saying that is unrealistic. The only thing I would use sometimes to make sure I'm happy with my assumptions is this, especially this number, to say how much of the value of this company is coming from the terminal value. So you have the free cash flow of this company for the first 10 years and then the last terminal year, and how much of that's coming from the terminal year versus the first 10 years. And we could play around with that to adjust that. So let's say if we set this to 24%, okay, so we can see that that's going down. Ideally, that should be somewhere between 50 to 70%, that the terminal value should not account for most of the actual value of the company. So that's just something to play around with to say, okay, what's a realistic amount and what's not so realistic. So I don't think there's much you can do other than just adjust these, but sometimes the numbers are the numbers, but it just helps paint a picture of what the terminal growth rate is going to be, with the terminal multiple and things. But I would say our assumptions are fairly conservative and realistic. And this is just a small bit of sensitivity analysis that I try to do. It's not exactly the same as a normal sensitivity analysis, but I try to measure what a change of 2% in operating margin would do to the fair value, and what change of 2% to revenue growth rate would do. So which one's more sensitive to changes or fluctuations in the fair value? Well, in this version, it shows that 2% change in the operating margin leads to a $7 or $6.94 change in the fair value. So this is the most sensitive aspect of the entire value drivers, which the most important value drivers, I would argue, are the revenue growth rates, the operating margins, and the sales to capital ratio and cost of capital. You could add potentially tax if you wanted to do so. So you can see that here the tax rates are 25% titrating down to 25.21, titrating down to 25%. You could argue that it's a very European company, so I should be taxing at their corporate tax rate, but I don't want to get into that right now. It doesn't actually change things that much. If I was going to adjust this to, I think the corporate tax rate in Germany is 22%, but it's just some of the things that you should be aware of. And sometimes it depends on where the revenue is coming from. If the majority of the revenue is from America, then you're going to be taxed on the tax rate in America. So it really doesn't matter too much in certain instances. So we've just looked at the DCF valuation. How about we look at the total shareholder return as another measure, which basically says that the main drivers of total shareholder returns, i.e. Returns to you, the equity holder, are coming from the growth of the earnings per share and the dividend yield, as well as the buybacks. But buybacks are usually calculated as part of the earnings per share. So those are the main things. In addition to that, we have the contraction or expansion of the PE multiple. Now, let's take a look at that a little bit closer. So let's just look at the back end of our PE equation. Now, I have a thing where people tell me a PE is high, a PE is low. I'm like, well, what did you mean a PE is high? What's the growth rate? And then it's like, oh, well, they're growing at 35% revenue CAGR for the next 5 years. I'm like, well, maybe it's justified. And how do you justify these things? And that's where I get into those discussions with people. There is an implied PE number out there everywhere, because an implied PE takes the inputs that you're implying is that there's a certain amount of revenue, there's a certain amount of reinvestment in the business that generates that based on the cost of the equity. And most people might not think that far in terms of how they perceive the PE. It's just, oh, it's too expensive, it's too cheap. Yes, high PEs are not sustainable for a very long time because you cannot keep reinvesting or cannot keep growing at those rates. That's why it's important to put it into context. So we have, for example, here a EPS growth for Carl Zeiss of 7.75. I feel that's very sustainable. The cost of equity is all right. And then you have the return of equity. And these are all the inputs that I use to come up with this implied PE. And I would urge you to take a look at the work of Professor Aswad Demorder, and again, how you can generate these if you're interested. If not, I could always make a video about it one day. And then we look at the unadjusted number of the PE, and it's 27. That's miles off what we're seeing here with the implied PE. And the adjusted normalized PE, which is another way I try to look at things, where you remove the cyclicality of the earnings and make it much, much more smoother. And you adjust it as well for the R&D, and then you come up with 14.37. Of course, you could argue that I'm trying to make the story fit, right? But generally I don't go in there after the fact and adjust the numbers. I just do those beforehand. And you can see that the implied PE is very close to the adjusted normalized PE, and that's telling me I'm almost that close to fair value for this business. So it's a good time to get interested in it. And then now we're going to start talking about the total shareholder return. Well, the total shareholder return, as we discussed maybe in the previous section, was the inputs are the earnings growth rate. So we have the earnings per share at 7.75 plus the dividend yield. And then you have the expansion or contraction of the PE. So if we're taking this as our PE, 14.37 adjusted normalized, we can say there's a slight contraction of the PE to 13.48. Now, if I was to change this to say, let's say there's an expansion to 15, that should also go up, right, to 8.28. But we're being very conservative in saying that the Implied PE is what the future PE will be like for this company in 10 years' time. And therefore, our total shareholder return is 7.22 and putting us at around $122 for the fair price in 10 years. These are fairly conservative, estimates, and I'd like to keep it that way. So a lot of people now are familiar with reverse DCFs, which basically means that you start with the stock price and you work your way backwards to what the inputs are. And for the most part, a lot of people run these reverse DCFs looking at one input in particular, and that's the revenue growth rate. But as you might have seen in our assessment of the sensitivity analysis, the four value drivers, which are revenue growth rate, operating margin, sales to cap, and cost of capital. The operating margin in this case was a bigger revenue, had a bigger effect on the fair value, and as such, it might be more worthwhile to look at just the operating margin instead and adjust for that as opposed to adjusting for the revenue growth rate, which, these are nuanced things, but I would like you to think about that if you're looking at an investment. And in my assessment, when I look at these, I try to look at both. I've used this kind of Monte Carlo simulation to generate assumptions about how the revenue will change and the operating margin will change. For anybody here who's statistically inclined, of course, I'm making a little bit of an assumption that the distribution of the revenue growth is normally distributed, as you can see in this curve. But normally, you're going to have a big fat tail on one side, and it's asymmetrically skewed. So you could use like a log normal curve. And I don't want to get anyone overwhelmed with that discussion, so we'll leave it there. But generally speaking, based on the assumptions, we have an average growth rate of 7% with an operating margin of 24% is what's baked into the price currently. And of course, 24% is my adjusted numbers, but I'm using those to base my story. And I'm happy with that to say that, well, those expectations are not otherworldly and they're not far off what my DCF expectations are as well. So we can see from that the reverse DCF, the EPS, the total shareholder return, and the DCF, that we have three measures and they're all within that range. And I'm happy to say that, this company, if I can get it at 7% now, I will take a small slice of it. But if it continues to drop even further before the earnings, which are due, I think, within the next week or so, then potentially there could be a bargain there. But I hope this has been useful to you. So yeah.
So that's everything for today, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. And if it's been useful to you, please do let me know, leave a comment and let me know what you think. And hopefully I'll be able to cover more deep dives in the future. And please stay tuned for that.